Jungle fever, baby. And that's not a metaphor.
What a predicament!
Welcome to What a Predicament, a podcast that prods and probes the predicaments of the modern day and age. And today, yes, this very day that you're listening to this, I'm putting stand-up comedy under the spotlight. In episode 10 of What a Predicament, where I looked at what's up with podcasts themselves, I spoke to comedian and podcaster Bill Conway, and he joked about the big crossover of those two professions.
Here in America, there was actually a law passed by Senate that if you do stand-up comedy, you have to have a podcast. It's a law.
So I figured that as I'm a podcaster and I want to get the skinny on stand-up, I might need to go undercover and try my hand at the funny business myself at an open mic. But how does one go about that? And is it worth it? A comedian or comic is defined as a person who seeks to entertain an audience by making them laugh. Sounds innocent, right? But comedians are in the news on the regs for their controversial statements. In a world where syllables spoken in a specific order can cause great harm, the job of the comedian has never been more fraught with danger and arguably more important. The first issue I'm faced with when it comes to comedy is that, as anyone who's heard this podcast can attest, I'm not especially funny. Despite What a Predicament technically being in the comedy category of iTunes, I'm happy if I can get one wry aside an episode that might make someone half snort. But that's one half a laugh in 1/2 hour. I'll really need to step up my game if I want to get that same kind of response in a 6-minute set. I need some advice from a real-life working comedian. Lauren Mabbutt is an Auckland-based New Zealand comedian and grand finalist in the annual Raw Comedy Quest in 2016. She has appeared on such TV shows as The Ellen DeGeneres Show, so she is the perfect person to get some pointers from. How long have you been doing comedy on stage, and at what stage doing that could you officially call yourself a comedian?
So yeah, that's quite an. I don't have like the typical answer for that like most people do, because I started 5 years ago. I did 3 open mics, and then I went and did an OE. So I completely gave up everything I had started doing, and I had like 1.5 to 2 years off. And I still called myself a comedian then, even though I'd done like 3 open mics. So I wouldn't say I've been doing it for 5 years because I had that huge gap. I've been doing it solidly now for 2 years. And I call it solidly because I've been doing like 1 or 2 gigs a week at least, which I think is quite a standard amount to do. And I've always said that I do stand-up. I've never called myself a stand-up comedian until I started getting paid. So you have a lot of people who say, I'm a comedian, and you go, oh, cool, like, you know, where do you perform? And they're like, oh, I've done 1 open mic 3 years ago. And you're like, oh, all right, so maybe not.
You just identify as a comedian.
Yeah. I didn't want to call myself a comedian until I got paid to do comedy, which even now that I get paid, I still feel weird saying that. I feel like I'm a hack somehow.
You'd said it was not a very typical journey. Is there a typical path that someone would go to become a comedian or a stand-up comic? What's the usual way someone would go about that?
Actually, maybe not, because I feel like everybody does have their own path and their own race and their own journey. Mine was just a little bit dumb because by now I could have been doing comedy solidly for 5 years and be way higher up than where I am. I don't think it's typical to take like a 2-year hiatus. But yeah, everybody's got their own path. Some people just completely like go up the ranks really, really fast. And I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason, but yeah, no, I think it is pretty different for everybody.
I can only imagine. I'm trying to get it through my head. I'm about to do an open mic spot, which I've never done before. And I imagine a lot of people would get up on stage and almost imitate a established comedian or pretend they're someone. You get up and pretend, oh, I'm going to be Larry David or Seinfeld or Louis or whatever. would you say that that's the case? And if so, who were you pretending to be when you first got up?
I think you can be inspired by different styles of comedy. Is that what you mean? Like, you're not
kinda.
trying to be them, but you're
Like, when
you're
you-
emulating them.
When you have in your head that I want to do stand-up comedy, your image of what stand-up comedy is Louis C.K. being on stage doing his act,
Yeah.
or whatever. So you're like, oh, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Before you find your own voice necessarily.
Well, definitely, yeah. I think it does take a little while to figure out your own voice, your own self. Mine would have been Ellen DeGeneres, because she was the reason I got into stand-up, because I related to everything she said. I thought she was so funny. And so I guess my writing would have had an element of her in it. But now that I've been doing it a lot longer, I feel like it's completely different. And I've sort of changed. You do see people go up, especially at an open mic when it's their first time. And it's pretty obvious that they're trying to be somebody that they admire, which often doesn't work because it's their first time. And the first time is never good.
Yeah, well, that's part of what I'm worried about is I know that the first one, you kind of almost have to rip the Band-Aid off, just get that first one over with. But if you've got any advice, what are some hack mistakes you see beginners make that I can maybe try and keep in mind?
What could you do that's... I think there's hack topics. Everybody talks about Tinder. And everyone in the comedy scene is so sick of hearing about Tinder. I guess another hack thing is just like talking about sex and stuff. Like a lot of guys go up especially and they think it's going to be funny if they talk about, just typical like sex jokes and dick jokes and all that kind of thing. I like things that are just a little bit different, be a little obscure. I've seen a few as well, maybe think it's quite funny to insult the audience on their first and second time, which I'm not sure why they think that that's a good idea. But you want to try and get them on your side, and the best way to do that is just be funny.
Well, one thing I was worried about is the idea of parallel thinking, which is I come up with something that I think's original and it's been done. I figure I'm trying to write some material and I realize in all the open micers in the history of the world, surely someone's had the same connection of this topic to that punchline or whatever. So how can you avoid parallel thinking, and how are you supposed to Google every joke you write and check that it hasn't been done before? Because then if you second guess yourself, then you'll just never get on stage. Or how do you sort of, I don't know what my question is, but I'm just worried that would be a trap I'd fall into, that it's like, oh, that was, Greg Giraldo said that in 1999.
Well, there's definitely parallel thinking, and there's definitely like going along the same lines, like thought lines as other people, which I think we've all done. You just want to be a little bit. It's unlikely that you're going to word for word copy somebody else's gag, and if you do, then it is definitely a bad thing, and someone will probably point it out, and you'll hope that somebody will point it out. I've done jokes before where people have pointed out that the idea has already been done, but my take on it was different, which I guess is a good thing. And it's up to you at that point if you want to like keep doing it or not. I try and steer clear of anything that's already been done before, but I don't think you need to get to the point of Googling all your jokes. Yeah, it depends. It depends how in depth you've written them and how Alex you've written them.
It is tricky, yeah, getting up for the first time. How long did it take you to find a voice? You said, now that you've been doing it a while, but
I still am looking. I honestly am. I'm getting there. Like I'm getting closer. But after like 2 years of solidly gigging, I still am trying to figure out what kind of style I am and stuff. Yeah, I still don't have it.
So what's your process when you're getting a set together?
Do you? There's different types of gigs that I would do now. Like there's open mic type gigs where that's where I would go to try something new, and so that's going to be pretty loose and pretty raw and not very good at all. There's other gigs I go to where you're expected to. You can do a little bit of both, a little bit of like new stuff, and you want to have some fairly good stuff in there too. And so once you've got more bits, like more gags, you can just kind of mix and match them together to put together your set for the night. Do you know what I mean? So when you're starting out, you've got 6 minutes, and that's probably all you're going to have for a little while, and then you'll slowly add to that bit by bit. And once you've written more and more, you can sort of swap them around and mix and match and stuff.
And I was thinking specifically about the early days. Would you
Yeah.
show people stuff or preview it in front of friends, or do you just kind of not want to taint it with other people's input? Do you just want, this is my thoughts, and if you start allowing doubt in, or, that may compromise it, or you'll cut all the edginess or whatever out of it. Would you run stuff past people, or you just went for it?
I didn't want to. I don't like the idea of that. I think the best gauge is just do it in front of the audience and see what kind of response you get that way. My very first gig, I was quite good friends with Vaughan King, who is one of the classics, and he pushed me into it, and so he wanted me to show him what I'd written, which was incredibly nerve-wracking because it's my own personal thing. I had no idea what I was writing, and I had to sit with him and do my 6 minutes just with him
To an audience of one.
looking at me. Yeah. And he gave me a couple of good tips to change stuff. That was the only time I've ever shown anybody my material before I've done it. But yeah, I think even when you're on stage doing it, different things will come to you, and I think that's just the best way to move forward, is just get out there and do it and see what works and see what doesn't. And even if something doesn't work the first time, you've got to try it like 5 more times in front of different crowds to see if it's actually a keeper or not. But yeah, I think the audience's reaction is the best kind of gauge as to whether you're doing well. You can do it in front of your family and they'll probably just, it's not the same atmosphere. Sitting in a lounge.
Get one person's specific taste. They may say, "Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't get this," and then you're like, "Oh, well, that sucks." But maybe that's just them.
Yeah, well, it's almost like when you tell somebody you're a comedian, they go, "Oh, tell us a joke," and it's not going to be the same if you just sit with somebody at a table and go, "All right, well, here we go. Here's my," because it's all part of the atmosphere, and performing on stage, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, it's like the context. And speaking of context, you've done comedy both here and in the US. What differences have you noticed between the two countries and the style of performing or the other acts that you've seen?
Well, I've done one gig in New York, which was just an open mic. But the big difference I think I would have noticed is we had to pay to perform, which obviously here haven't had to do yet. And the audience got in for free. So comics had to pay $5 to perform. Audience all watched for free. And there's quite a bit of that sort of like you have to bring so-and-so friends, everybody has to have 2 drinks, all that kind of thing. But yeah, there wasn't a huge, for the actual like performance, there wasn't a huge difference at all. Like the audience found the same kind of stuff funny I did the same jokes that I do here and it was totally fine. You just have to change, I guess, your slang words, like things like whatever we say, like op shop, I would say thrift store, that kind of thing, just so that they're not like, what? But yeah, I would like to do more. And I think once I've done more, then I'll probably see heaps more differences.
One tool in the comedy toolbox I've seen you utilize before is the almost shock value of saying something that you may not necessarily say and that you couldn't get away with saying in polite conversation, but on stage and with the setup, it can be quite funny. And these days you'll hear about comedians in the news because someone's blogged about, they've talked about this topic, or can you believe what this person said? So where do you personally draw the lines about what you will and won't talk about or joke about on stage?
I think I'm personally I play it pretty safe in the scheme of things, but I'm still really new to the comedy scene. Like 2 years isn't a lot, and I don't have the tools to kind of to format something edgy in a way that somebody like Louis C.K. or Bill Burr can get away with. Like Louis especially will talk about like the N-word and he'll say cunt and stuff like that, but he'll do it in a way that it's passable, like he's that good that he can get away with doing stuff like that, which I definitely couldn't. So my parameter is very tiny. I'm way too much of a wuss to kind of deal with any kind of, I don't want to stir up any kind of problems with the audience and things like that. I kind of want them on my side. So I feel like I do play pretty safe. And the ones that you're talking about, like where I do sort of whip something out, I've been lucky that those ones have been accepted. Yeah. But I think it is context as well. I think that's a big part of it.
No one's ever blogged about you.
No. What?
Petitioned
I don't think most
outside
people know who I am.
So what's the hardest you've ever eaten it at a gig?
There's like a few sort of open mics and stuff that are hard because usually there's no audience. And so you're kind of just performing to other comedians, and that's always a little bit tricky because you always expect to get that laugh after you say a punchline, and in rooms like that you don't. My worst ever gig was at a Big Wednesday where I had a lady from the comedy festival come to like scope me out, and I had to go last on a really long night. It was a long lineup. The crowd did not want to be there by the end of it, and I just did 7 minutes to silence, like 7 minutes to absolute silence, and it sucked. I'm hoping that she was like, switched on enough. She works at the Comedy Fest. She would have known, like, everyone has a bad night, but really disheartening when you put yourself out there for 7 minutes to people just staring at you with a straight face and their arms crossed.
Or in contrast, what's the best set that you've ever had where you just were on?
There's been a couple where you walk away just being like, hell yeah, that was awesome. But there was one night, again, it was a Big Wednesday actually at the Classic. I love those nights because there's such a variety of what kind of acts you're going to get and what kind of audience you're going to get too. And Brendan Lovegrove was the MC, and I think I was going about fourth, and the 3 people that went ahead of me just completely died. Like, they were great, but the audience gave them nothing. And I was sitting there in the green room just like, shh, this night's going to suck. Like, get ready to, bomb completely. And I went out there and did my first open line, and I just got this huge, applause, and I was like, oh. And then I did the rest of my set, and every punchline was just bam bam, like real applause breaks and stuff, which are great to get during a set. And it was really cool. It was just really bizarre. And I got off stage, and then the guy after me bombed. I was like, I remember Brendan just being so stoked and saying so many nice things, and I struggled to take a compliment. But that was one night where I was just like, wow, you couldn't help but feel good on a night that everyone around you didn't do well.
And so what do you put it down to? The audience or your material? Or
I honestly don't know. I mean, I had done those same jokes before where they also did bomb, and so it's totally unpredictable. And that's the cool thing about comedy. You never know what kind of crowd you're going to have until you go out there and do it. And there are so many different types of response you can get, and every night is completely different, and that's what keeps it exciting. And that's what you'll find out when you start getting into regular gigs. Yeah.
And to wrap things up, when you were coming up, what was the best advice you ever got from another comedian?
I guess there's a few different things that you could probably take on board. Things like memorizing your material. It seems obvious, but a lot of people will either go up there with notes or they'll write things down their arm or something like that. And it's just never a good look if you're standing there like reading off a paper, especially when it's like shaking and going like that.
I was thinking
Very
of
obvious.
putting bullet points on my hand. I don't know if that's dumb.
That's not a bad idea. Like, just a couple of keywords I put there, so when you're holding the mic, you can kind of just like glance down and remember them. Be yourself. These all sound so cliche, but yeah, like, be yourself. Don't try to emulate somebody. Just do what you find funny and have a good time. Like, enjoy it. You're there to have a good time, and you're there to have fun. And if you're not having fun, then why are you doing it? That's really all there is to it. Try and be excited about your material. Remember your material and just have a really good time doing it. You only get one first time doing comedy, and it's going to be something that you'll remember if you pursue it. Like, if you keep doing it, you'll always think back to your first time. So yeah, just make it a good one. Have fun with it. And don't put too much pressure on yourself. Like, it's a Monday night, it's an open mic. There are some people who really bomb horribly, obviously. It's their first time. It's never going to be an amazing set. So don't go up there expecting to be like Dave Chappelle straight away.
Yeah.
But just, yeah.
I've been to the Monday Raw nights just as an audience member, and the audience seems pretty forgiving. I think they realise that what people are doing is scary and difficult.
Definitely. Yeah, and the MC, like, you'll have an MC who will say that to the crowd. They'll mention, these guys are new, don't heckle them, give them as much energy as you can, and they'll give you more. And yeah, no, it's a really comfortable place to start.
Awesome. Now, where can folks check out your stuff?
I'm mainly just around Auckland. I just do. I mean, I have a profile on the Comedy Classic website, so that normally lists my gigs for the Classic. But otherwise, yeah, I'll just be floating around. There's a lot of different bars around Auckland that put shows on. The Lumsden, Nightingale, Harry Bar is another one. Revelry around Ponsonby. Yeah, just go along and see all the different Auckland comedians because there's a lot of us.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Good luck.
Taking Lauren's advice, it was time to check out an open mic night, which only served to make the whole idea terrifyingly real. There's even more to getting up and doing it than I thought. Things that never occurred to me, like where to move the mic stand, how much do you pace around versus standing still, allowing time for laughs in places that you weren't expecting. I'd already written a couple of things, and luckily no one was doing the exact same material. But the one guy whose act centered around dry puns got groans, which is annoying because that's all I was planning on doing. Seeing the talent of even the newer open micers, I realised I'd have to up my game and go back to the drawing board in about half my set. Time to book myself in for an open mic spot, so I reached out to the club's owner, which is intimidating on a couple of levels. The term stand-up has its origins in the mob. Back in the day, a lot of nightclubs were run by wise guys, and stand-up was the mob name for that one guy in the crew who always comes through with the jokes, a stand-up guy. So, putting on a brave face, I arranged to sit down with the Don of New Zealand stand-up. Scott Blanks is the founder and operator of The Classic, New Zealand's premier comedy venue, which has recently celebrated its 20-year anniversary. They hold a Monday Raw night where the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed can try their luck on stage in front of a paying audience. He might be the one man who can talk me off the ledge of trying to back out of this ill-advised undertaking. So, first of all, how did you come to run the largest comedy club in the country? Is your background performing? Or?
It is performing. Suppose as far as comedy goes, I was a great fan of comedy in my youth. As I turned into my teenage years, I was quite addicted to Monty Python. Just showing my age. Loved Monty Python. Loved some local comedy. Fred Dagg was something I really liked and made me laugh when I was young. I didn't pursue any career in comedy. I actually trained as an accountant, but I soon realized that wasn't my calling, and I got into the entertainment industry, working in marketing for a film distribution company that that was associated with a cinema chain. You might remember the Kerridge Odeon cinema chain years ago. I worked for them for 10 years. So I learnt everything I needed to know about the local entertainment industry, particularly the media, entertainment media, radio, television, print. Learnt a lot about that in that job. And I started to moonlight promoting a local stand-up comedy troupe called Funny Business, which I helped launch. So that was my first foray into producing live comedy in Auckland. And we toured it around a bit, and they made 3 TV series, which were quite sort of cutting edge. They were sort of our version of Monty Python at the time. And so that gave me connections with performers, which I sort of maintained, eventually ending up with a sort of a super group of comedians that helped start stand-up comedy at Kitty O'Brien's Tavern in Auckland back in about 92 it was. And we dabbled in local production and expanded our business to the point we were confident enough to actually take over of our own venue and develop it into a comedy club, which was the Classic Cinema on Queen Street. So that stage was called the Adult Cinema. It was a porn house. It had previously been called the Classic Cinema. So we brought that name back and called the comedy club. We called it The Classic. So that's a quick précis of my background.
The Classic's pretty well respected. You've got comedy greats like Stuart Lee, for instance, described it as one of his top 5 spaces to perform worldwide. What makes the Classic such a well-respected venue?
Well, the requirements of a good comedy room are fairly straightforward. Everyone in the room should be able to see and hear the comedian clearly. If it's a dedicated space for comedy, it helps, and that's one of the things we did when we developed the venue. It was modelled on a comedy club called the Improv in Los Angeles, which is pretty famous. And very simply, they had a bar and restaurant out front where the audience could gather before the show. Then you'd walk through a set of double doors into what they call the showroom. And the showroom is a room that you would only be in if you were watching comedy. And of course, in places like Las Vegas, they talk about the showroom and things like that. But not all comedy clubs in the world have that simple separation between people arriving and buying their tickets and ordering drinks, and people sitting down to watch the show. By having a showroom, you can control the atmosphere a lot more. And of course, at the Classic, everyone can see and hear the comedian. There are no pillars, barriers. There's no sort of dog legs in the room with half the audience sitting around a corner, which happens in lots of other comedy rooms. And it has a nice height to the ceiling. The proportions of the room are funny, if there can be such a thing, but proportionally it's a really good room. And that's the thing overseas comedians have come to play, and people like Stuart Lee appreciated the most, was just the fact that the audience was totally focused on what they had to say. And that is half the battle. Once the comedian has the focus of the audience, and also the audience has invested in the show, they've actually paid a door charge, so they've invested in the show, they have a contract with the performer, then anyone who's a good comedian will fare very well in that environment.
What about the comedian themselves? What are the general traits of what makes a good comedian?
They have to be confident. There's a thing we say that is a lesson to be learnt by young comedians, is when you walk out on stage, don't ask the audience if you're funny, tell the audience you're funny. So the audience, when you walk out, has no doubt they're about to watch a comedian. Of course, that's very easy when your name is Billy Connolly or Jerry Seinfeld. You can walk out at the Spark Arena in front of 10,000 people when you're Jerry Seinfeld and not really worry too much, because those 10,000 people are watching you. It's your show. Your name's on the bill. They've paid anything from $100 to $200 to see you. They're totally invested in this being a success. Of course, you could say that raises the expectations, because expectations are a major part of comedy. But Jerry Seinfeld, quite frankly, I mean, he is going to be able to deliver on those expectations. And Billy Connolly in his prime, no problem delivering on the expectations of the audience. They think you're going to be funny. You are funny, and everyone goes home happy. Of course, the mission for a new comedian, a rookie, is a little bit more difficult because, of course, there's a lot of doubt. There's doubt in the comedian's mind that they're going to be funny. And, of course, the audience are doubting that they're going to be funny too.
Well, you talk about confidence, but a lot of comedians, I imagine, are people who are quite self-critical, and there's sort of the cliche of the sad clown, and so many comedians tend to succeed in drama, like Robin Williams or Louis C.K. So what are your thoughts on that phenomenon of the sort of a sort of sadness within the comedian?
Look, no problem at all, as long as they've got something to say. I mean, the comedian has to have a point of view which they believe in and they use as a focus for what they have to say. Being angry at the world can be very, very funny, as long as the comedian can communicate and get across what is funny. So comedy is all about the expectations and surprises. I mean, a great comedian will have a premise that they'll take the audience down, and then there'll be the outcome. The punchline is unexpected. The audience are surprised, and that's what makes them laugh. So a good comedian can have any point of view. They can be bright and happy about the world. They can be like Michael McIntyre with a kick in his step. He's never really grumpy. He can complain about stuff, or you can be a Louis C.K. maybe, who comes out and angry about the world and don't you just hate this, and have you ever noticed that, and what is it with, those sorts of cliche lines. Well, as long as when he says, have you ever noticed, and the audience go, yeah, but we've never thought of that punchline, then he's done his job. So I don't care if they're grumpy or happy, as long as they're funny.
So what do you believe, as someone who's spent a lot of time watching comedians and had a whole career in the scene, what do you believe the role of the comedian is in society?
Well, if you went back to very olden days with court jesters, they supposedly can say things that no one else can say and be immune from the wrath of the
king.
of the king. I'm not quite sure who the king is these days. Maybe there's people in the audience who are the kings, but the comedian definitely is observing things about society which sometimes need to be said. And you could say that a good comedy industry and a healthy comedy industry is a sign of a healthy community. that a community that can laugh at itself. Now, if you then go around the world and think of some of the trouble spots in the world, maybe places you might think twice about visiting, and maybe then do a study on how many comedy clubs those places have, you might see there's some sort of equation there. But definitely when you look at the big industries, England is huge on comedy, and America, of course.
Both trouble-free places.
Well, they're not trouble-free, but they do have the ability to look at themselves and laugh. And if you can't laugh at yourself, if life is just so significant that you can't laugh, then that's where the problems start. Because people who are overly significant, effectively, that's what comedians do best is tear down significance, tear down self-importance. And you can see that happening right now. I mean, thanks to Donald Trump, we have the ultimate target for comedians. It's making life too easy for them at the moment.
Well, I've heard a few people say he's hard to satirize because he's so extreme that you can't really make it further extreme.
Well, no, and no one wants to be a hack. And quite frankly, extracting the comedy from Donald Trump is too easy. And the hacks are doing it. So the hard part is having something really original to say. He's certainly feeding the talk show hosts in the States. I mean, the stuff coming out of Jimmy Kimmel's show and Jim Jeffries' show, I was just looking today at that, the latest stuff from their shows, even John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, all of them. There's so much coming out of those shows at the moment. They can't even avoid the topic. Poor old John Oliver, every time I watch his show, you can see that he wants to talk about other things, but he has to start every show with Trump because it's just like the elephant in the room. You can't ignore it.
Speaking of hacks, the Classic hosts a weekly Monday Raw night, which is what I'm gearing up to give a go. And you've seen hundreds of newbies come and go, some with probably more promise than others. What are some common mistakes you see people make on their early times getting up?
We do have a little list of 10 things you want to get right before you even start talking. It's funny that these are the mistakes that people will make. Not being prepared when your name is called, so that suddenly you've got caught up in your world and you're much further from the microphone than you should be. So you have to rush to the microphone and you're not ready to take it. Not knowing what to do with the microphone when you get there. There's a microphone stand and there's a microphone. Are you going to use both bits of equipment? If not, get rid of the piece of equipment you don't intend to use. I would recommend you use the microphone though. But the microphone stand, you can take it or leave it. But should you decide to not use it, get rid of it. Don't stand behind it. It's just not big enough to hide behind. So move the microphone. These are the funniest things that just help to tell the audience that they're about to watch someone who has a vague idea of what they're doing. And of course, at a Raw gig, we set the audience's expectations very low. We promise them a host who knows what they're doing. The host comes out and says, right, this could all go horribly wrong. The best way to have a successful comedy night is if you, the audience, get behind the acts, whether they're good or bad, whether they trip over or just have a blinder for their first gig. Just be supportive of everyone. And then I just say to the comedians, look, this is what we've told the audience. They're ready for it. They're not expecting you to be God's gift to comedy. So don't worry when you're not. There's no point. The audience aren't expecting it. Sit back, have as much fun as you possibly can while you're as nervous as. But if you're having fun, the audience have fun. If you screw up, go, God, I've screwed up. That's okay. If you don't think the audience have noticed, don't mention it. Just keep on going because, of course, they don't know what your script is. Hopefully, they don't even know you've got a script. Although, of course, there's always notes written on people's hands or a bit of paper floating around. If you can avoid all of that and just go out and say what's on your mind, you will get off to a good start.
And speaking of being prepared for when they call your name, how many beers do you reckon is the right amount before getting up?
Well, I always recommend none, but there's nothing wrong with one if that helps relax you. Any more than one, then you're starting to introduce a variable into your show, and you'll only create doubt in your mind as to whether you're funny or not without alcohol. And it's not a great way to start,
Start as you mean to go on.
Yeah.
So, as far as going on goes, when you get into the professional scene, I could imagine it's weirdly, in a way, it would be competitive, but compared to other industries, it isn't necessarily a bad thing if there are people better than you, because aside from trying to get work, you're like, well, great, I want there to be a lot more funny people in the world. But then there's the dichotomy of like, well, if that guy's funnier than me, I might not get hired or whatever. Do you notice much of that sort of back and forth thinking?
Well, we're very lucky in New Zealand that we seem to have an incredibly supportive community. I like to think that the Classic has something to do with that and the way we've structured our shows and promote them, because a lot of the overseas comedians come here and they can't believe how supportive the comedians are of each other. Apparently, where they come from, they say it's dog eat dog, and particularly in very competitive environments like Los Angeles and London. People are jumping over each other, climbing over each other to get the next best gig. We're a lot more supportive here of people. I don't think it's because everyone necessarily wants more comedians, but I think they realise that everyone with stage time becomes a better comedian. But not everyone is destined to become a great comedian. It's just not going to happen. There's always that last 10% which you cannot buy or be endowed with or be born with. There's that 10% X factor difference that some comedians have, and no one really knows why. It would be difficult to be able to put it in a jar and say, here it is, here's the last 10%, go away and have this and you'll be fine. So the comedians are supportive of each other, knowing that they're all going to get better, also knowing that some of them are probably going to be more successful than others. But we haven't got to that point in New Zealand yet where people are stabbing each other in the back, because the community is still very small. And we do tend to build up little peer groups. So, for instance, at the Classic, each year we have a new wave of people. They all enter the Raw Comedy Quest together, and they sort of cluster as a little peer group as they go through that competition and hopefully make the finals. And I notice that sometimes you get quite good buddies building up from that, and they carry on through their future years as pros, still quite closely in touch with each other. And the buddy system is a good one. If you can have someone you can rely on off stage to watch you while you're on stage and give you good, honest feedback, and you do the same for them, that's a really positive, because you sometimes just can't tell what's happening on stage when you're the comedian. I've seen people come off stage and be pretty blind to what has just happened. They definitely need someone to tell them what was good and what was bad.
Do you see people who get into comedy for maybe the wrong reasons, perhaps not trying to become a better comedian, but to try and, just promote themselves? Like, I was listening to an interview with Ben Hurley on the Stuart Goldsmith's Comedian podcast, and he was saying, for everyone who's getting into it because you want to be a director one day or you want to do this, get out of the industry. He sort of valued comics. Do you see people who don't necessarily have the best intentions, or what do you think is the right mindset to go into it with?
Well, I because comedians come from all walks of life, and I've seen them, the people who line up on our Raw nights, they come from everywhere. We have some very promising ones that come up through the Class Comedians program, which is a filter which produces some really good young comedians. We have people who have thought about it for a while, maybe in their 20s, and decide to give it a go. Then you have sort of, I don't know, you call it people in maybe a midlife crisis who have gone, I've always wanted to do that, but I had, stuck with my job, I had a family, I've got kids, but I just want to get this out of my system. A lot of those people do get it out of their system and then walk away because they don't want to start yet another professional career and go through the 5 to 10 years process it can take to become a pro comedian, But they will give it a go. And sometimes they've got a lot to say because they've had more life experience than, say, your young teenage class comedian. So sometimes it's not a bad thing to have these people turn up with a fresh perspective. You just don't necessarily expect them to stick around. There are people who are compensating. There's no doubt there are some comedians that are compensating for something in their life. Depending on how they're dealing with that, compensation can decide whether they're going to be successful or not.
Talking about comedy school, is comedy something that can be taught? And if so, what are the key lessons?
Well, there's a lot of craft to good stand-up. Physical craft about how you act on stage and how you how you tell the audience you're funny rather than ask them if you're funny. There's also the craft of writing, just having the discipline of writing. And the best way of learning how to do that is to ask other comedians. So once you start, you go, well, you could easily turn around to your newfound friends and go, hey, I'm having trouble writing. And find out how they do it. Everyone will come up with their own system. Sharing those systems amongst you can help a lot. As to, where do you find you're funny? What if it's not just coming out naturally, what do you do? And there's people do all sorts of things. They read the daily paper, or they watch CNN. Maybe they just read books on how to. I don't always agree with those, but I think every little bit of advice can help. Sitting down with comedians that you admire is really useful, and watching comedians you really admire, someone who sort of vaguely relates to your way of doing it. You should watch them again and again and again, not to copy them, because of course plagiarism is not allowed. But if you watch the same comedian again and again and again, what you'll do is you'll get past the magic, which is what the audience see in the first instance, the magic of the comedian. You'll get past the magic and you'll start to see their craft. You'll start to go, oh, I see what they did there. I see, and simple things like, the way they set that up at the beginning and then called it back later on. The way they revisited a premise 3 times and got 3 big laughs out of one premise instead of 1 laugh out of each premise. So you'll realize that you can be a lot funnier, like, say, someone like Seinfeld, in a short space of time if you have one major setup and then 3 or 4 big payoffs.
What other words of advice would you have for people who have long thought about it but never gotten up? I would think that just having the confidence is quite a difficult part, feeling that you've got something to say. One thing I'm concerned about is I've written what I think are jokes that are as good as I can do at this stage without any more experience. But I feel that in the history of open micers, surely all of this has been said before. How do you sort of give yourself the confidence to just be like, well, screw it, I'm just going to go for it?
Well, approach it, ignore what everyone else has said before, because every comedian is a fresh voice. There are stock premises. There are so many young men that have just broken up from their girlfriend. There must be so many broken relationships in this world. Of course there are. But how many comedians come out and go, I've just broken up from my girlfriend, and that's going to kick off their little thread. But don't worry about it, because you've got to get started. You won't necessarily continue to talk about your broken relationships after your first 10 gigs. But if that's what gets you through the first one, or the first 10, whatever, you've got to learn the lessons, have something to say, get out and say it. Don't worry about the fact that you might be a cliche. Certainly lower your expectations. That helps a lot. There's nothing worse than a young rookie that's really hard on themselves, and you go, geez, if you'd done 100 gigs, you could be hard on yourself about whatever you did there, but you've only done 1 or 2 gigs. Just have fun, kick the ball around. You'll learn the tricks, but just at the moment, you're just kicking the ball around.
I imagine, talking about the first set, it may be terrible looking back on it. I'm sure most top comics would cringe if they had to hear their first ever open mic set. So how dumb would it be for me to sort of record that set and then put it out publicly for download on the podcast? Knowing that it's going to be...
Well, considering the topic of your podcast, there might be listeners who will be expecting to hear what you had to say. They'll go, they know you've got a predicament, and your predicament is doing raw comedy. And of course, public speaking is humankind's greatest fear, more so than death, according to surveys. So we've added to that the expectation of being funny. So you've got public speaking with the expectation of being funny. So a lot of people are very, very afraid of that. Some of them may admire you for doing this. They might want to hear what you had to say on your first gig. Well, I think actually there's plenty of value, because we have people who come along to Raw nights. I can sometimes spot them before they actually sign up. They're generally on their own, and sometimes they're carrying a notebook or not. But they will buy a ticket to see the show, and you sort of look at them and go, wow, it's a Monday night. Odd that you're out on the Monday night on your own. And
that was me on Monday. I don't know if you...
Right, I thought your face was familiar. And then they'll sit there and they'll watch the show, and they might do that for 2 or 3 weeks. And I'll generally say to them after about 3 or 4 weeks, because I actually sell the tickets at the door, and when they buy a ticket off me, I'll say, so when are you signing up? Or they'll come to me before I get to that point and go, look, I've been watching this. I think I can do it. And that is important because they're watching people getting it right or wrong. But somewhere amongst that, they've sort of slipped themselves in there and gone, I think I would fit in here. I'm not saying that I'm going to be the best one on the night. I think I'm better than the worst one that was on tonight. So at least I know I might be able to hold my ground. That's all they want to know. So they might hear your podcast and go, Alex, he had a couple of good gags, but I reckon I've got a couple of good gags, so I think I'll give it a go.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I'm going to set my expectations, is that I'll be the benchmark for people to be like, oh, well, I can do it if he did that. Well, I'm better than that.
Well, my advice, start with a strong one. Ask around, try your material out. If someone says that's a good gag, start with that. And then if someone says, and that's another good gag, finish with that. The audience sometimes doesn't remember the bit in the middle, but you certainly gain their confidence if the first thing you say gets a laugh. So you've said something and they laugh, you go, great, we're off to a good start here. And then finish with a laugh, they'll go, God, that last guy was pretty good. That joke he said at the end was brilliant, My advice would be, don't get stuck on one topic for 6 minutes. If you think you've got a really substantial bit of comedy about something that is 6 minutes long, you might want to save that until you've done a few more gigs, or extract from it the most important bit, the funniest bit. I mean, you mentioned people having their first set. Some comedians hang on to their first set for a lot longer than they should because they get very attached to it. It's like a newborn baby, and they want to nurture it and keep it. There is a point when you have to move it to one side and start again.
Kill your darlings.
You have to kill, yeah. And the thing is that you're always trying to keep the winners and move the not-so-winners to one side. I don't say throw them away, because you might, with more experience, revisit some of your old material and go, in hindsight, I now can see how to make that funnier. So you never throw anything away. You will end up with lots of notebooks with stuff written in them. And you'll go back to those, and sometimes you'll go, I don't know why I wrote that down.
Any final words for me, and me being the stand-in for anyone who's standing up for the first time?
If you sign on, turn up. Don't chicken out, because it's a black mark and people remember that sort of thing. So when you sign on, do turn up. Don't worry that it's not going to go well, because my system is that I don't judge people on their first gig. Either way, if I see someone have a really, really good first gig, I don't suddenly get very excited and think God's gift to comedy has just walked through my door. I certainly wait until their second gig, because it might have been just a one-hit wonder. So don't turn up, do it, and knowing that I'm going to give you a second chance no matter what happens on the first night.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Whew. Nothing left but to do the actual thing now. I'm recording this just before I head off to the Classic, and I'm feeling it. To be honest, I'm feeling more nervous about my material than the public speaking. Whether what's funny in my head makes sense to anyone else. And actually, now that I say it, I'm also worried about the public speaking if I just mind blank on stage and forget what I'm supposed to say next. I've been practicing. My partner's an actor, and she told me I should just drill it over and over again and commit it to muscle memory. So the way I went about that involved recording myself, reading my set onto my phone, and then I listened to it on a loop for about half an hour plus each day, talking along with it until eventually I had it pretty much memorized. And the muscle memory trick does work. I find I can just rattle off chunks of it without it really even being aware of what I'm saying. It just rolls out at this stage. But that doesn't make me worry-free. Some of what I wrote ventures into the edgier side of things, and I've tried to be really careful to make sure it's clear what I'm saying and what the joke is, but I have no idea how a crowd is going to react to a newcomer hitting all the taboo topics. And structurally, I'm wondering whether stuff I call back to in the end is set up well enough in the beginning, if it's obvious enough, but it's too late to try and rethink anything now. I've got no time left to memorize it. I'll take Scott's advice and not drink anything before going up. I was practicing last week and I did my 6 minutes through a couple of times. Then I had one beer and tried again, and it all went out the window. So If I crash and burn, I don't even have booze to blame. So here, unless I completely chicken out, is my first crack at stand-up. The audio's just going to be recorded off my iPhone, put on the side of the stage, so apologies now for the poor audio quality and poorer material. Hello, my name is Alex Bain. If you can't already tell, this is my very first time trying this. I'm brand new, so I thought I'd start by telling you a bit about my background, which is a heavy black curtain. And the reason it's here is acoustics. It's basically soundproofing. It absorbs sound waves as opposed to a hard surface that would bounce them back. I think the concern was I'd get so much applause, it might compromise the structural integrity of the building, which I thought was optimistic. I told them, I don't know if we're going to need the curtain, I'm brand new, but, at least if I don't hear any applause tonight, I can just tell myself we're both doing a hell of a job, so curtain material. I do want to do a good job, so I've been reading this old book on stand-up comedy, and it's been really useful. I've learned about a lot of the basics, a few different facets of comedy. I learned about the rule of threes. I learned about irony. Then I had to take it back to the library. I didn't need to get past that bit. Although one part I did retain is that confidence is key. Now, you can't tell because I've been practicing, but I don't always have this infectious enthusiasm. It's all an act, I'm actually quite introverted in real life. It takes me a long time to adjust to new situations, so this is just as unpleasant for me as it is for you. But, I just can't be one of those charming people you meet who goes up to you and shakes your hand firmly and maintains eye contact and uses your name 19 times in a sentence. I feel like I'm suspicious of those people. I feel like those are all techniques they got out of some book on how to win friends and influence people, and while one of those books might benefit me, I feel like if you have to learn how to behave around other human beings out of a book, you could be a psychopath. Which is rich coming from me. I would stand up out of a book, making me a comedy psychopath. I want to kill, but I'll probably just come off as a bit of a weirdo. More about my background. I'm from Christchurch, so as you can imagine, I'm quite racist. I like to think I'm a sensitive person. I'm attuned to the suffering of others, but there are certain things that you absorb growing up in the rural south. Like, I remember being at a family barbecue when I was young. I was about 7 years old, and it was just my family, some family friends and neighbours, and Mum asked me if I wanted a sausage or a patty off the barbecue, and in front of everyone, 7-year-old me says, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catching N-word by the toe." And I could immediately tell I'd said something wrong, but I didn't know what. I was just repeating something I must have heard some other kid say. I had no idea what I just said. And of course now, as an adult, you cringe. You just think, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catching N-word by the toe." It's a horrible way to catch one. But it just seems, impractical. Like, you'd have to come up with some sort of Home Alone-style trap to remove their shoes. Or lie in wait in a place where you know they're going to have to take their shoes off, like a trampoline, which presents a whole new set of problems. And even if against all odds you do manage to carpe digitus and seize the toe, if he squeals, you have to let him go. Unfortunately, the eeny, meeny, miny, mo incident wouldn't be the last time that I put my foot in it and said something ignorant. When I was about 21, I was flatting with this couple, and they were a little older than me. They were married, and they were trying to conceive. And I walked into the kitchen one day, and they had all these maps and charts laid out, and they were figuring out when she was ovulating and at her most fertile. And I knew nothing about this, so I naively asked, "Why don't you just have sex every night?" And she, who had lived in the real world a bit longer, said, "Can you imagine having sex every single night?" I told her I do. So the other thing I learned from this old comedy book, other than the rule of threes and irony, was to end with a crowd pleaser, something safe. So, who wants to hear a rape joke? Of course you don't, that's the right response. Admittedly this was a very old book. But there are certain people will try and say things like, oh, you have to be able to joke about everything. You know, they say, you know, it's very important. You've got to, creating taboos around certain topics is only going to drive proponents of free speech further into offensiveness. And they say it's vital to the democratic discourse that we built this country on that we're free to tell rape jokes. Well, some people just won't take no for an answer. The third time I instantly regretted saying something. I was doing my first open mic spot at the Classic. Oh, the irony. Comedy Psychopath strikes again. Thank you.
Alex Bailey. It's hard to take anybody by the toe. Okay.
What a predicament that was. Listening back to that set, it sounded like when you listen to podcasts on 1.5 speed or double speed, I just barreled through it, propelled by nerves. I can't believe I didn't forget anything. I was the only first-timer in the lineup, 8th up of the 10 open micers. So I had a lot of time to sit there and just let the tension build. I'd sit there in the green room and try to mumble my set to myself, and I'd progressively forget more and more of it as the moment drew closer. When the MC finally called my name, my mind was blank. All I knew was I had to go out and say, hello, my name is Alex Bain, and hope the rest came to me. Apparently it did. I can't tell you much more than that because it was like I blacked out and just ran on autopilot, which the other comics backstage were saying is common in your early days. We got lucky with the audience, who were great. Now I know what entertainers mean when they say, oh, you're a great crowd. They were supportive of everyone. Even me. Despite, or maybe partly because of how nervous I clearly was. It was terrifying, but in the way skydiving is terrifying, I imagine. It's a rush, it's totally surreal. Afterwards, you just can't believe it happened. At least that's my take on it. If stand-up comedy is something you've always wanted to try, I hope this podcast has been helpful. Feel free to flick it on to your funny friend who's never had the confidence to book themselves in for an open mic spot. The more funny people out there, the better. If you think this episode of What a Predicament might inspire someone who didn't think they could do it until they heard my hack set and realised they can at least do better than that, you're more than welcome to go give What a Predicament a review in iTunes. Say, I don't know, a 5-star one? That helps bump it up and make it easier to find when you search for it in iTunes and helps it stand out amongst the gigs and gigs of comedy podcasts. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Lauren Mabbitt. Check out her profile on comedy.co.nz or check out her Twitter where she posts some amusings at Lauren Mabbitt. That's with 2 B's and 2 T's. Thanks to Marissa Holder, thanks to Scott Blanks from The Classic, and to everyone who came along to my open mic spot and humoured me as I tried to humour them. Credit where credit's due, the opening theme music for What a Predicament is a derivative of The Little Hotel of Horrors by Documentarium, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0. This little number here is Phil by Cy Hart, and is more of a creative achievement than anything I'll ever do with this podcast, which, by the way, is a Watercat production. For more Watercat stuff or to get in touch with me, head to watercat.co.nz. I'll throw up some photos from my open mic setup there. They'll probably also wind up on the podcast Instagram page at Watercat Productions. Weeks now lost in this jungle. Delirious with fever and starving. How could things get any worse? Wonderful. Okay, Alex, gotta find shelter. Ooh, a cave. Whew. Well, I'm stuck here until the storm passes. I think I'll while away the time by working on a new episode of the podcast. Check back in 2 weeks' time for a whole new predicament.